Good morning, church. Yesterday, Mary and I helped our youngest son and his wife move, and in all of the hubbub of getting ready for the trip to Kansas City and going to the Prayer on Mass event and then working on finishing the sermon, I completely forgot that yesterday was one of my favorite holidays, and one of my son's favorite holidays as well, International Talk Like a Pirate Day. So I had to call him and apologize. I did think about preaching my message today like a pirate to make up for it, but I decided against that. But we do have a nautical theme going through the message, as you'll see. Can I get an R from somewhere? There we go. All right. Well, in this series, we're exploring the cry of lament, deliver us from evil. What should we do when we find ourselves face to face with inexplicable evil? What does that prayer for deliverance mean? What does it look like? So we began by noting how frequently we find lamenting in the Bible. It's the proper response when we're confronted with suffering and evil. We turn to God with our pain, offer it to Him with our tears, and choose to make the turn, to make that conscious decision to trust Him, even when the situation hasn't changed, and even when we can't see that the circumstances will ever change. We choose to place our trust in the God who promises to rescue us from evil. And we saw that there are good reasons for making that choice to trust Him. Because Jesus has broken the power of the enemy through His resurrection from the dead. He's promised to help us in our time of need. We no longer need to fear the grave. Because we're in Christ, His victory is ours. His resurrection is the promise that we will also rise with Him. We need not fear the grave. And God's not just watching us from on high, trying to see how things are going to go, checking to see if they can handle the pain. God has entered into our pain, became one of us. And Jesus demonstrated God's heart when He wept at Lazarus' tomb, because He's the God who weeps for us. He weeps with us in our suffering. He grieves with us when we're hurting. Jesus promises we'll live even if we die. And everyone who entrusts himself to Him will never die, will have eternal life. So we know that He will deliver us from evil by bringing us into His eternal kingdom where all pain, all sorrow, all death have been eliminated. And then last week, we looked at the problem of temptation. Because sometimes, actually many times, the prayer, deliver us from evil, means help me turn away from these evil desires that have grown up inside of me. Help me escape from the snare that my enemy has laid for my feet and which I keep stepping into. Save me from my transgressions, these repeated oversteppings that I make. Well, God's deliverance often comes to us in a way we're not even thinking about when we cry to Him for help. He reminds us about our need to lay aside these desires that take us away from the path of godliness, that take us away from kingdom living, that take us back to living for ourselves. And He changes us from the inside as we embrace a different way of thinking that's focused on becoming more like Jesus. Not about getting what we want. And the escape from the snare happens as we learn to deal with our internal desires that keep tripping us up. We learn to walk down a different path instead of going back to those same old paths that keep leading us into the traps. But that's not to say that everything about temptation is internal. There are lots of external inducements out there, external enticements, and they are real and they are strong. So I want to pay some attention this morning to another aspect of temptation, these enticing voices that are all around us, that are embedded in our culture. They appeal to our desires. They promise to give us what we're seeking. They lure us into making choices that will only lead to our own destruction. They are like sirens. Okay, not like the one that blasts on the hill at 7:45 a.m. Not that siren. No, they're like the sirens of ancient mythology, the Greeks. So my sermon today is titled, What to Do When a Siren Sings. Well, sirens were already a part of Greek mythology and legends when the Ionian poet Homer wrote his epic sagas, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in the latter half of the 8th century BC. But it was Homer's depiction of the sirens in his tale of Odysseus' adventure-filled journey home from the Trojan War that really made them famous. So according to legend, sirens were half bird and half women, and they lured sailors to destruction by the sweetness of their singing. Their songs were so captivating that any sailors passing by who heard them would either leap into the sea and be drowned, or they would steer their ships onto the rocks where both ships and crew would be destroyed. So in Book 12 of the Odyssey, Circe the sorceress warns Odysseus about these sirens because he's going to have to pass by their islands on his way home. And so he and his crew must put beeswax in their ears to prevent them from hearing the siren songs. Otherwise, all will be lost. Well, Odysseus follows her advice and he prepares his crew, but he wants to hear the siren song. And so he leaves his own ears open. And he instructs his men to tie him firmly to the mast and to not let him loose no matter what he says, no matter what he commands, no matter what he does. And so his men obey, fortunately for all of them, and Odysseus and his crew, except for one, make it safely past the Sirens' Island. Hey, it's a great story. There's a reason that the roots of Western drama and theater go back to the Greeks. They're great storytellers. And by the way, if you've never seen it, I recommend the hilarious adaptation of the story of Odysseus that was made by the Coen brothers, "O Brother, Where Art Thou?" It is the retelling of Odysseus, and it's hysterical. Anyway, I'm not going to get off on that. Now, the story of Odysseus, I think there's probably some good practical advice for avoiding temptation in that story as well. But the truth is, you can't block your ears against every song that's out there. And hoping that the ropes will stay secure when you're determined to try and enjoy temptation somehow without falling prey to the destruction that it leads to, that's a very risky move. More than a few fools have tried Odysseus' methods and failed in the process. There's one particular siren song that's nearly impossible to avoid. It's especially powerful and captivating, and that's the song we read about in our passage today, Psalm 73. A psalm that was written about 250 to 300 years before Homer composed his saga about Odysseus, but it's as relevant to us today as this morning's Lawrence Journal World. Psalm 73 has the form of a lament song, but it isn't exactly a lament in the classical sense. We do hear the author's complaint, but instead of being a prayer for relief in his distress, Psalm 73 is written after the fact of God's deliverance. It's a reflection looking back on what it was that led him to despair and how God answered him in his pain. It's really more of a prayer of wisdom, a way to pass on to those who read it, who hear it, the lessons that he learned with difficulty that are now guiding his steps. So I would submit to you it's a very good well from which to drink this morning as we think about temptation and sirens' songs. Well, the author of Psalm 73 is a man named Asaph. And Asaph was a Levite. The Levites were the tribe that was assigned to assist the priests by taking care of the place of worship for Israel. They were responsible for carrying the tabernacle components around while the Israelites traveled in the wilderness. And so they would disassemble it when it was time to leave one spot, and then they would reassemble it when they came to the next spot. And while they were camped in one place, They were responsible for the care of the shrine. Later on, when Solomon built the temple to replace the tabernacle, they were the ones responsible for taking care of the building maintenance and for various tasks related to the service of worship, such as opening and closing doors and hauling wood for the sacrificial fires, playing the music, and standing guard. Although they were not allowed to offer the sacrifices, that privilege belonged to the priests, who were also from the same tribe but had to be descendants of Aaron. The Levites were devoted to the work of keeping the sacrificial system of worship going for the people of Israel. To put it in terms that we might understand today, they were sort of the trustees of their day. They had to do all of the work of keeping the building together, keep the thing going. Well, Asaph was also one of 3 chief musicians that David appointed to lead the worship in the tabernacle once he'd moved it into his capital city of Jerusalem. And so the descendants of Asaph were temple musicians. They were prominently featured in the book of 1 Chronicles, which tells us that they were still a very significant family in the temple worship after the return from exile, more than 500 years later, after his years. But the fact that Asaph was a Levite and that he was a musician in the tabernacle is particularly significant for understanding this psalm. This is an intensely personal psalm. So first of all, Asaph was a Levite and someone devoted to maintaining the worship of Yahweh. So he would have been especially conscious of the importance of maintaining personal holiness. Because every day he's reminded of the need for sacrifice, for cleansing from sin. Every day he's reminded that God had saved Israel, brought them to their land, and that he had been chosen by God to serve in the holiest place on earth, the place where God promised to dwell among his people. Every day he goes into work. That's what he's faced with. And any violations of the covenant that would have rendered him unclean would prevent him from entering the tabernacle in order to do what he was supposed to do, to perform his work. So he's acutely aware that righteousness matters to God and that living a holy life was what God required of his people. Second, because he's a Levite, Asaph's family was not given any land of their own. When the Israelites conquered Canaan, the Levites were not given any land. Instead, there were a number of villages and cities that were designated throughout the land where the Levites would live. And so they would travel from where they lived to the central shrine to do their work, perform their service for the Lord periodically. And since they owned no land, they could not pass it on. They could not inherit land. And that's the basis for personal wealth. Since they were required to work in the tabernacle, in the temple, they couldn't devote themselves to a trade. They couldn't develop some commercial enterprise, such as being a merchant. That means the Levites didn't have the ordinary means for personal enrichment that were available to every other Israelite. Instead, they were paid for their service through the sharing of the tithes that Israelites brought when they came to worship. Between that and their personal gardens and maybe a few sheep or goats, they would have enough to sustain their life, but getting rich wasn't in the picture for Levites. And third, because Asaph was a musician, one of the chief musicians for David, he lived in Jerusalem. As David's capital, Jerusalem was quickly becoming a growing and prosperous city, relatively speaking. It was still a smaller city even by ancient standards, but it was growing. And Asaph spent his days in the tabernacle, but he was very aware of what was going on in the city around him, where commerce is growing, and where a good portion of David's army is stationed, and where they're going to bring the spoils of war. He lived in the middle of a booming, thriving capital city in a time when the king was prospering and everyone affiliated with David was reaping the benefits as well. Well, almost everybody. Asaph begins his psalm with a confident declaration. God is good to those who are pure in heart. And that's immediately followed by his chastened confession as he looks back on it. He says, "But as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold." His heart had not been pure. God has been good to him. He's now returned from what was almost certainly a spiritually fatal misstep, because Asaph had listened to the siren's song, and it cost him, nearly cost him dearly. So what was his misstep? It was one of the most common failings in human history. "I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." He heard the siren's song that pointed out in great detail the abundance and the wealth and the ease of those who couldn't care less about the things of God. And the evidence was all around him. Not only were the wicked not being punished for their sins, they were absolutely prospering. They were amassing riches as a direct result of their willingness to ignore the commandments of God and even to defy Him. They mocked God. God doesn't pay any attention to this. He doesn't care what we do. Is He even looking at us? Can He do anything about it at all? Is He even there? And yet, despite their arrogance and their boasting and their pride, despite enriching themselves through violence and deceit and fraud, despite their wicked behavior, their malicious treatment of others, and their blasphemy toward God, despite all of that, they were enjoying life. They were enjoying the good life. They had plenty, while others lacked basic needs. While people like Asaph struggled to get along and had to be conscious of doing what's right. They luxuriated in their riches, and their riches comfortably protected them from the savageries of life, while the righteous had no relief for their sufferings. Asaph saw the stark contrast between what he lived on as a Levitical singer in the service of God and what he saw the wicked pulling in, and it gnawed at him. And it gnawed at him. They had more than enough. They had far more than they needed, and they had far, far more than they deserved. But Asaph? Not only does God give him less to live on, He adds punishments on top of it for the slightest offenses. He requires more of His servants than He does of those who despise His law. Why doesn't God treat them in the same way as He treats me? Why doesn't He at least allow me to gain a little bit more as a tiny reward for being faithful? Do you remember being told, cheaters never prosper? Remember that? I do. I heard it repeatedly when I was a boy, though the truth is it sunk in pretty deeply the first time. I didn't really need more repetition. And so I grew up, I couldn't imagine trying to cheat on a test. I couldn't imagine trying to hide income from the IRS or to defraud someone in order to get ahead in business. I couldn't imagine trying to win an election by stuffing the ballot box or paying a bribe to get what I wanted or needed from a judge or a government official. Couldn't think about that. Well, do you remember when you learned that it wasn't exactly true that cheaters never prosper? Right? That there were a lot of cheaters in the world and many of them were prospering quite well. Right? That a whole lot of people in powerful positions in the world got there by cheating? And that a lot of people in ordinary positions were trying to advance their place in the world by cheating, and they were succeeding at it? Do you remember when you learned that? For most of my years as a painter, before I was pastoring, and sometimes in the first part of that, I was self-employed. And it wasn't long as a self-employed contractor before I started learning what other self-employed painters and contractors were doing. And I met painters who offered discounts to their customers if they paid in cash, so that the painters wouldn't have a paper trail when they didn't report their income to the IRS. I knew one guy who said that when it came time to fill out his tax forms and declare his income, he just made up a number because they didn't know what it was either. I met a plasterer in the Chicago area, an immigrant from Germany, who boasted about his vacation home that he had in Wisconsin that was paid for entirely with income from jobs that he hid from the IRS. There was no question in my mind that cheaters were prospering quite well. The biggest news in baseball this past offseason was what? Well, it was that the Houston Astros, who won the World Series in 2018, had systematically cheated by using a video camera to record the catcher's signs and relay those signs to the batters by banging on a trash can. And even after it was found out, they weren't stripped of their championship. You know the common saying in NASCAR circles? If you're not cheating, you're not trying. High school teachers, university professors have been forced to develop new ways to evaluate students because of the prevalence of increasingly sophisticated means for cheating on exams. And that doesn't even begin to address all of the ways in which businesses defraud customers or their insurance companies, or the ease with which politicians and company spokespersons lie to the public, or the way powerful people use force and intimidation and the threat of violence and lawsuits to beggar their competition and to escape responsibility for their own wrongful actions. The basic assumption in our culture seems to be that anything that allows you to get what you want is acceptable as long as you don't get caught. Asaph saw all of the same sorts of things in his day. And the anguish he felt over the success of the wicked ate away at his soul, left him disoriented and wondering, why do I bother? Surely in vain, he says, I have kept my heart pure. I've washed my hands in innocence. What's the point? All day long I've been afflicted, and every morning brings new punishments. And that's when Asaph heard the siren's song. Come join us. You can have what we have. You can be free from your tiresome obligation to that demanding God who won't let you have any fun. He doesn't even provide a decent living for your family. What's the point of continuing to serve God when you can ignore His commandments and enjoy life in comfort and style? Friends, that song's been around for a long, long time. It's still popular today. And it's a very powerful enticement. It's particularly effective on young people. But actually, it can ensnare anyone who cares more about what they can get than about who they become. Asaph came perilously close to leaping out of the ship, so to speak. He was close to driving his ship onto the rocks. Because he was seriously considering abandoning his place as the chief musician in the tabernacle to take the next opportunity to trade his positions and his skills for a more lucrative offer. My foot nearly slipped, he said. Well, there's a difference between nearly slipping and falling headlong, right? When I was in high school, I was camping with a friend of mine in southwestern Colorado. We were hiking along a narrow path on a rocky ridge, kind of similar to what the picture is there on the slide. And that morning, just before we'd gone out for our hike, I had shared with him a verse that God had been bringing to my mind recently. Actually, so this might have been the year after college. Anyway, Psalm 37, 23 and 24 says this, "The steps of a man are from the Lord, and He establishes him in whose way He delights. And though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord is the stay of his hand." I talked about how God had been wanting me to memorize that verse. So we were walking, and all of a sudden, my friend lost his footing, and he started to slip off the edge of that ridge. And somehow he managed to throw his weight backward just enough so that his feet came out from underneath him, and he went into a slide down the side of the mountain. And he hit the bottom feet first, about 20 feet below me, and he flipped over on his side. I managed to scramble down and get to him. He'd broken his ankle, as we learned later, but at that moment, all we knew was that he was injured and he was in a lot of pain. I had to get him to the nearest medical facility right away, and that was miles away. So I helped him down to the trailhead, and fortunately, we hadn't gone very far that morning when he'd fallen. And I ran back to camp, and I got the car, and I brought it to him, and I drove him to the facility. He got some pain meds, and he got his ankle x-rayed, and they put it in a cast for him. And we went back to camp for an uncomfortable night before we headed back home early the next day. But it was on our way back to the camp that he said to me, "You know, when I started to fall, I remembered that passage from Psalm 37 that you shared with me. And I wasn't cast headlong over the ridge. God took care of me even when I was falling." See, his broken ankle was really painful. It wasn't as painful, it wasn't as devastating as it would have been to fall head over heels and break his neck or possibly die. Asaph nearly slipped. Then he made the turn. He stumbled, but he didn't fall. Asaph recognized if he was going to give in to what was in his heart, the envy of what others had and the anger that they were getting rich through violence and robbery and corruption and bitterness over what he perceived to be unfair treatment by God, if he were to let those sins rule in his heart, he would betray everything that he knew to be true. He would betray everything he was and he did. He would betray everyone among God's people to whom he was bound by covenant. To give in to the siren's song was to betray both God and his people, and that would leave him alone in the world with only the wicked for his companions, and he didn't fit there at all. Asaph still didn't understand why things were the way they were. He didn't understand why the wicked prospered despite being such treacherous and violent people. Why didn't God do something to stop them? Was what they said really true, that God didn't see, couldn't see, didn't care? He didn't have an answer. But he did the one thing that he knew to do, and it was the most important thing that he could have done. Asaph did the one thing that will free you from being captured by the siren's songs. He went into the sanctuary of God. He went into the sanctuary of God, the place of the presence of God. I don't want to suggest that there's some magic that can only happen in a holy place like a church building or, in Asaph's case, the tabernacle. Because the issue wasn't that he went into the building. What mattered was that he came into the presence of God. And when he came into the presence of God, everything changed. The most important thing that changed was Asaph and his perception. Because when he came into the presence of God, Asaph saw things differently. He recognized things that he couldn't see before. When he was complaining in his bitterness about the unfairness of it all he could see was his own misery. And what was controlling his heart, what was controlling his mind, was his mistaken perception that he was being mistreated and unfairly punished by God, while the real criminals were getting away with murder. Bitterness will do that to you, by the way. You let bitterness take root in your heart, it will eat at you like a furious cancer. And it will oftentimes even lead to physical cancer. Bitterness and resentment will blind you to what's really going on. It'll lead you to conclusions and decisions that are the worst possible choices you could make. The only way to get free from bitterness is to return to the presence of the Lord and to admit, as Asaph did, I was like a beast before you. I was so very, very wrong. I completely misread the situation. I completely misunderstood what you were doing. I was so ignorant, so mistaken. I repent. And you need to forgive those who hurt you and let go of that wicked desire in you to see them suffer as much as you've suffered. But it begins by returning to the presence of God. So Asaph returned. He came back to the place of the presence, and that's the place where he could see clearly. He could see from God's perspective. He could see what was really going on. He could see what it was that he needed to understand, what needed to change in his heart. And he found there three anchors for his soul, three things that hold on to. Three things, three truths could seal his heart against the siren song of envy and anger and bitterness. And the first thing he realized was the true condition of the wicked. They weren't secure in their riches. They were in a very dangerous, treacherous, and vulnerable place. You remember the rich man in the parable that Jesus told about? He said, I'm going to build bigger barns. Jesus said, you fool, you don't even know you're dying today. The wicked Asaph realized they were on the threshold of death, and they didn't realize it. And when they died, everything that they'd schemed for, everything that they'd stolen, everything that they'd amassed was all going to be taken away in an instant, leaving them empty and defenseless. And by the way, it doesn't have to wait till you die. God, a lot of that stuff can go in a fire, in a flood, in a tornado, in a disease. They would be empty and defenseless when they stood before the judge of all. The siren's song was a lie. What they offered was no value at all. The second thing he realized was he'd reached the point of no return. Once he got his perspective corrected, he understood that there was nothing on this earth that could compare to what he had in God. Whom have I in heaven but you? Earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail. But God is the strength of my heart and my portion. He's my portion. He's what I have. He's what's been given to me to keep forever. There was no one, there was nothing else that he desired more than being in the presence of God. The siren's song was just a pathetic imitation, because what they offered wasn't what he really wanted anyway. It wouldn't satisfy. The third thing he realized was that he discovered what was genuinely good. What was good was to be near God. When he was embittered in his soul, he thought that what was good was to be free from troubles and to have plenty and to be sated with food and comforts that brought you relief from the sufferings. But now that he saw that good wasn't really related to his level of comfort, good was what he had when God was near. I still like the translation of this verse, the way it reads in New American Standard. It's a bit awkward in English, but it says, the nearness of God is my good. This is what I've come to understand. This is where I've taken my stand. This is what I know to be good, to be what defines good for me. God is near me. God has come near to me. He has brought me near into his presence. And in his presence I can clearly see what it is that is the truth. Odysseus had an idea about how to slip past the sirens without wrecking the ship and losing his life. But it never really solved the problem in his heart, which is that of desiring what they had to offer. The only way to conquer the siren songs is to have stronger and better music playing in your heart. And for that, you need to come into the presence of God. And for that, you've got to come through the cross. You've got to come through Jesus.